And no bump out. Once again, Bare Bones Radio Show here. It's Brad and John. We're on Egbert, EGGBORT. Check it out, egbert.com. Now, before the break, John,
Yes.
we were talking about Mike Kehoe. And
Yes.
I've heard him twice give this story that he was a kid that grew up in North City. Now, think about it. He's not that old of a guy. And North City, shall we say, has been somewhat funky for like the past, 60, 70 years, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'd say at least.
Now, what's interesting is both of my parents and my grandparents were all North County people. Excuse me, North City people.
Yeah, both of my parents grew up in North City as well.
Right, and I believe Mike, either his father was passed away or left him when he was.
He just left. I believe he abandoned the family.
Right. So Mike grew up and didn't have a father and went through all sorts of things and ended up working for Dave Sinclair at his car dealership. And Dave sort of took him under his wing and pushed him and pushed him and pushed him. And I think he was selling cars and the whole bit. And then probably the big break for Mike was the Sinclair dealership, and I believe a couple other dealerships, I don't know if you know this story or not, they went together in this consortium and they made this company called Osage Vans. Are you familiar with Osage Vans?
No, I'm not.
Okay, Osage Vans was a company that built the conversion vans. And the idea being was, and the same thing that Bellman's did. Bellman's essentially ultimately, if you remember Bellman, GMC with the Bellman vans up there, 270 McDonald, they essentially started their own company where they converted the vans themselves. And that was the deal with Osage Vans. I think it was 3 or 4 different Ford dealers, and they went in, and the idea being is that they could buy the vans cheap because they were dealers. They would buy the stripper van conversion vans, and they would take them down to Lynn, Missouri, where Osage Vans was, and then they would convert them and they would sell them as these conversion vans. And Mike was sent down there to run that company. And then when the conversion van business sort of bit the dust, they switched to making ambulances. Did you know this part of it?
I didn't know that. No.
And Osage, I believe Osage is still one of the main manufacturer of ambulances in the country. And matter of fact, they for a long time they were huge in the Midwest. Matter of fact, you could look at a lot of different. See, because I'm a nerd, I'd look at stuff like that. Every time I'd see like a fire department ambulance or something like that, it would have the name of the builder, because those are not built by the manufacturers. Essentially, they buy a what they call a commercial chassis, and then they convert it into an ambulance. And then from that point, I believe I can't remember the exact story how he ended up in the car business, but he had several car dealerships that he bought and sold those and became, shall we say, very wealthy. So he's a guy that, that sort of rose from the ashes, so to speak. I shouldn't say the ashes, but you know what I'm saying. I'm fascinated by people who, when you look at them and you find out that they're this tremendous success, and then you talk with them and you find out they have been kicked, hit, stabbed, shot, drugged behind cars. Their life has been sort of a living hell. And at some point in their life, they've said, okay, I can just continue to, have this life like this, or I can, pull the covers over my head and not get out of bed every morning, or I can, grab my life by the reins and turn myself around and really move forward. And I'm always fascinated by those kind of guys.
You think about the fact that a percentage of people who grow up in that environment go the complete opposite direction.
Well,
and they're riddled with addiction, they're riddled with other things, and we hear about those folks too, and you just don't know what the percentage breakdown is.
It's like me and my 4 kids. Okay, I have 4 kids. I have 3 sons and a daughter. Okay, and I look at the environment they were raised in with me. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been in the radio business. I've run businesses since like 1984, a long time. Okay, and I sometimes think to myself, the reason my kids aren't interested in this is because they see me. They see me working a lot of hours. They see me, having issues where, it's not all, great and wonderful running a business. Sometimes you have to fight the government. Sometimes you have to fight, competitors. Sometimes you have to fight the guy down the street who just doesn't like because of the fact you own a business. I mean, sometimes it's really weird stuff. But yet by the same token, I look at my kids right now. My daughter's an attorney. My one son graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science. He's worked for, since he's been out of school, he's worked for Garmin. He's worked for Amazon, and now he's decided he doesn't necessarily like the big company environment. He's working for some smaller tech firms. He worked for one, and then he got another even better offer from a tech firm in Boston. If I told you the names you would not recognize, and he likes that small kind of operation. My oldest son, is down in Florida. Matter of fact, he works for a plumbing supply place. He's a sales manager. And my youngest son, matter of fact, as of yesterday, just took a new job where he's a guy selling insurance.
Yeah.
So, and I'm trying to say, look at this. I'm thinking, okay, and I can look at some of the things that have happened, with my kids, and I think to myself, okay, why didn't they do this? And I think to myself, well, I know why, because I did do that, So, and
absolutely,
it's like me with my parents. My parents loved Buicks. Don't ask me why. My parents loved Buicks. If you gave me a new Buick, hey, Brad, you're a nice guy, I would go and I would trade it in somewhere for something different. You know what I mean?
Immediately.
Yeah. And I know people out there drive Buicks. Nothing against Buicks. Buicks make a transition. Buick was like Cadillac. Buick was like the poor man's Cadillac. It used to be that if you had a lot of money, you had a Cadillac. If you didn't have a lot of money, if you had some money, you had a Buick. And usually high end, the land yacht kind of vehicles. That's not what they are anymore. It's the same thing with Cadillac. Cadillac's gotten to be, their main competitor is BMW. Most of the Cadillacs are sporty. They have they call the V series, which is, the very high output engines and the sporty, the sport transmission or the sport suspension systems and stuff like that. So who the hell knows?
Hey, as a kid growing up in Spanish Lake, the day that we were able to get a 1985 Buick Regal. I should say it was in 1985. I believe the car was a late 70s model, but that was a big day in our household. We had a red Buick Regal. It's one of the first cars I remember.
Yeah, and once again, back in the day, most of the Buicks were family cars. They were.
Oh yeah, it was huge.
They were the 4-door grocery getter kind of cars.
Yeah.
I mean that kind of thing. And once again, things change. Things change. And me being a car guy, God, matter of fact, there's things I can tell you cars that I've owned that if I had today, I would have some serious money. I mean, I there's a car that I owned. I owned a 59 Cadillac at one point in time. 59 Cadillac with the big
holy cow,
big tail fins with the bullet tail lights, a whole bit. 2-door coupe, very white with this silver glittering interior. If I had that car and it had been sitting in my garage since 1973 or 74 when I bought it, I can't remember. I think it was 72 or something like that, 71, 72. If that had been sitting in my garage all this time, even if it wasn't in the best of shape when I got it. It had some rust and some other issues, but no body damage, never been in any serious accidents. If I had that car sitting in the garage today, I could probably put it on, one of the, cars and bids or, bringatrailer.com or whatever, and probably get $40,000 or $50,000 for that car.
Yeah, unquestionably.
Right.
I wish I had known you circa 2014, Brad. My dad had inherited his mom's, I believe it was a 1963 Bel Air. Do you remember Bel Airs?
Oh, yeah.
And just a beautiful car. And after my dad passed, we sold it. But it was amazing. And, folks came from probably 2 hours away somewhere in Illinois and drove. And I was like, you sure you want to make this drive? Like, are you going to show up? And they showed up and they paid cash for it. I don't remember how much it was.
Well, the Bel Airs and the Impalas of that area, the early 60s, have gotten huge with the lowrider guys. The guys
I believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, they do the different suspension, the pneumatic suspension, stuff like that. Plus, it's just a car that everybody likes. It's one of those things. It's like right now, like if you go back, there's certain even not that older cars, but if you go back to like the early 2000s, I think, as a matter of fact, they call them, it's the Chevy pickup trucks. They're called the cat eye trucks. Because the front of them sort of looks like cat's eyes. I'm thinking from like 2003 to about 2008 or 2009 was that particular style. Those things are getting unbelievable amounts of money. And even what they call the OBS trucks, both Ford and Chevrolet, which are the very boxy, there was a time when, especially the Chevys were really boxy. If you go look at the old Ford, the old Chevy, with the C10, S10, whatever they were, they weren't the 1500s like they are today now. Same thing. I mean, those things are just being gobbled up by people, and the money that people are paying for those things, it's unbelievable.
I bet. Well, it's anything where you have limited supply, and every year a certain percentage of those goes away. Some days I wish I had my 1980 Olds Cutlass because at least I knew how to. I could change the oil in it myself. I could fix everything myself, and I'm not even a car guy. And when you explain to young people today that you used to be able to go to AutoZone or Advance Auto or wherever and get a book that tells you how to fix everything in your car, they look at you like you're crazy.
Well, now you just go to YouTube.
Yeah, and now you go to YouTube.
You
That's
just go
right.
to YouTube, and I do it all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, most of my vehicles are fairly common cars, so I'll have like, okay, I bet you there's a YouTube video on this. There's 10 YouTube videos on it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's like-
absolutely.
and to the
You know
point-
what's interesting, Brad, when you mentioned St. Louis City and then the county and then like the Mike Kehoe story, someday, probably soon, there will be demographic information where we could count the number of families that moved, like yours and mine did, from St. Louis City to North St. Louis County to St. Charles County.
Well,
Like and imagine how common that migration path is in the last 60 years.
did you ever see the movie? Was
I
called
did. It was really good.
Spanish
like
Lake?
the documentary.
Yes. And what's so fascinating about that is if you look at the whole situation, and I'm going to ask you a question. If you remember the movie, what would you say the number one issue that caused all the crazy situation in North City and North County? What would you say the number one issue was?
The lack of local government in Spanish Lake to protect itself from Section 8 housing.
Well, that was part of it, but I think the overarching view I had was government sticking their fingers where they shouldn't have been sticking their fingers.
You mean, but in what regard?
Well, the federal government, they once again the whole idea behind, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex,
for sure,
which
absolutely.
which has been repeated in Chicago
Of course,
with Cabrini
yep.
Green and things like that. Essentially, the government thinking, "Hey, we've got this way. We know how people will love. We're going to build these great big tall,
Absolutely.
great big tall apartment buildings, and people are going to love it." And it didn't happen. And if
Without a
anything,
doubt.
it went backwards.
Yeah.
And then to the point where what happened, see, the thing that still bothers me about the North County thing is that to this day, and you and I have even talked about this on the air, we haven't done that many shows, but it still bothers me that people go like, well, North County was always sort of like not so nice. It was sort of creepy, and the people there were not very well educated, and they were all like lower middle class, and a lot of them were blue collar. A lot of them, a lot of guys were trash men that worked up there. Okay, once again, I'm a guy who went through kindergarten through 12th grade in the Hazelwood School District. Twillman, Kirby, and Hazelwood High School, okay? I could tell you, to this day, I can say to you, there were classes when I remember where the teacher would ask this question, and they would say, how many of your parents work at McDonnell Douglas? And half the class raised their hands.
For sure.
And
Absolutely.
among my friends, my dad was a civil engineer. We lived in North County. The guy that lived next to me was an electrical engineer from Emerson. The guy on the other side of me was a mechanical engineer. I can't remember where he worked at. There were several people that I worked with. Matter of fact, a girl that I dated in high school, Jessie Johnson, her father was
Yep.
a mechanical, or I can't remember if it was a mechanical or structural or aeronautical engineer. He worked on the F-4 program, which was the big fighter plane that McDonnell Douglas built, and I mean for years, and there were guys in my class that that their father was a supervisor, a blue collar kind of thing, but they were working on all the projects. We did the Gemini space program.
It was, and I had a number of friends growing up too, and my path was similar. I went to Larimore Elementary, and then Kirby, and then of course Hazelwood East. But I had so many friends whose parents worked at McDonnell Douglas and were engineers.
Right.
And for folks who don't know, who haven't seen this film, the entire film, which is just called Spanish Lake, a documentary, is on YouTube. You can watch the whole thing for free on YouTube.
Do you know the backstory behind it? It's a pretty interesting backstory. Do you know this story?
Yeah, the gentleman who grew up near me in Spanish Lake on one of the streets off Larimore Road went back and actually saw his house and was so moved by what happened that he did the documentary.
Right, and it was pretty interesting because he became like a filmmaker. I think he was like working for one of the big studios in L.A. or something like that, and he was on a layover. He was going from New York back to Los Angeles and had like some free time, and they changed his flight or something like that. They had like 4 or 5 hours to wait, so he just rented a car and just drove up into North County, and went to his. The interesting part of it is went to his old house, and that's part of the interesting part of that whole story. And the downside to it was some people criticized it because there were a lot of interviews, and some of the interviews were people like, well, that was somebody who lived in North County, but that wasn't the majority of people. I mean, I'm not trying to say that some of the interviews were like people who they were North Countyites, but they weren't like your typical North Countyites, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. I mean, we can say this in the St. Louis colloquialism. He was able to find a bunch of people who would self-identify as Hoosiers,
Yes, exactly.
and who would who would talk very frankly about race issues.
Right.
My only qualm with the movie is that the filmmaker is quite progressive. So the bad, if there's a bad guy in the movie, it's not the federal government for sure. It's white people who don't like black people moving in. So it does have a woke tinge to it.
Right. Well, you put it quite nicely. The people he interviewed were the kind of people that you would think would not live in North County. They'd live like back in the day in Jefferson County.
And they're Arnold or Festus.
Right.
Like they would self-identify as Hoosiers.
Right. Or way back in the day, St. Charles County. Once again,
that's exactly right.
My boss, when I moved to St. Charles County back in 1984, 85, my boss, Ron Grubbs, comes in the studio one day. Hey, I heard you're moving to St. Charles County. And I said, yeah. He says, did you buy a single wide or a double wide?
Yeah.
So that was
my perception in the 1990s as well, Brad. I mean, I got to be honest.
It's crazy. I mean, go out there now. I can show you multi-million-dollar homes. I can show you things you wouldn't believe. Okay, we have to take a break. It is 7:42.